Joining us now is Frederic Attakumah, who's president of the Ghana Chamber of Mines, to unpack how Africa can position itself at the forefront of sustainable mining and what it will take to balance growth with responsibility. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thanks, Impo. Thanks for having me on your program.
Thank you very much. Perhaps let's begin here. Africa holds many of the minerals critical to the global energy transition. How can the continent ensure that it captures more value from these resources rather than just exporting raw materials?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid question, Impo. And I think the logical next step beyond what the continent has been doing for several decades, as in digging the minerals, is actually doing the value addition and processing here. The opportunity that is presented is, we need to get to the point where the value drivers, especially when it comes to multipliers, are actually realized on the continent rather than the current scenario where that happens elsewhere, and we, just get the revenues from the raw minerals as opposed to the situation where the finished products are here. So the conversation has to move to how do we build the refineries, how do we build the smelters, how do we get all of those, onshore on the continent, as opposed to having them out there. Of course, we need to make the difference between the different types of minerals. Some precious minerals are maybe slightly different when it comes to the value multipliers, but with bulk minerals, etc., that definitely is something we need to look at. And more so when it comes to the critical mineral space, where we need to move beyond just the lithium and cobalt to batteries and magnets, which drive, as it were, the technological development we have. But an important point I would like to make is that if you look at the mineral resources in our respective countries, the resources themselves know no borders. You would have mineral resources straddling one or two countries, and all of that. So sometimes to get to the point where you can actually develop a business case for value addition, you would need scale, as in the quantum of minerals that you have. And so countries need to start thinking more regionally and sub-regionally when it comes to beneficiation of the resources, rather than every individual country doing it by itself. We need to start looking at where, would be the best place to situate a smelter. What's the transport infrastructure? What's the energy situation there? All of these would have to come into play, such that, we can actually have an outcome that benefits everybody. This will require a new way of thinking about how we develop our resources, and frameworks would have to be developed for it. But if we go it alone, we won't be able to maximize the opportunity ahead of us.
That's a fantastic point. As you talk about developing this business case, how can the continent then ensure that there is a value chain, so to speak, especially ensuring that this resource boom translates into jobs, industrialization, and economic transformation, rather than repeating the mistakes of previous commodity cycles that we've seen over the past decades?
Absolutely. I think that's another very valid question. I think we need to start looking a lot more seriously at mining as a growth pool around which we can develop, and industrialize. The beauty of mining is it covers quite a number of sectors. If you look at our inputs, there are very, very different inputs, from energy, from reagents, even technical services and all of that. And we need to start looking at how we can build linkages between our mines and our local economies when it comes to, whether building manufacturing capacity, whether building service capacity, etc. Because ultimately, what you want to create is an ecosystem of a sort that ensures that there are many touch points between the industry and the local economy. That is actually what drives the creation of jobs, because if you can build those linkages, you are creating service companies, supply companies, and importantly, not just companies that would still import from other places and just supply to our operations, but rather companies that would invest in local manufacturing capacity, because then you maximize the socioeconomic benefit. It will require, some careful thinking. It will require governments having a longer term view, even putting in certain instances the tax incentives that would allow the investments to be made, if you like, in the manufacturing situation I'm trying to describe.
Yeah.
Because if we approach it that way, then you actually get a full benefit. You don't only create a mining industry, but you create a mining ecosystem, which is surrounded by a set of, if you like, manufacturing capacities that are providing all the inputs that are needed.
Absolutely. And mining is increasingly being labeled as green, so to speak, yet it's still a carbon intensive industry. How do you reconcile the environmental footprint of mining with a global push towards climate action?
I think that's another equally important point. I think these are things that, talking about green mining, these are things the industry, particularly the large-scale industry which I represent, has been doing for a very long time. Mining is quite international in nature. Many of our companies are listed, publicly, and today's investor wants to be sure that your ESG credentials are in place. So when we talk about green mining, basically you're talking about environmental stewardship, where you're looking at, to borrow the example you just used, your greenhouse gas emissions, understand your footprints, and importantly, identify a pathway or a set of pathways that would enable you reduce your carbon footprint. So many mines have come out to say maybe a 30% reduction by 2030 or 50% by 2050, and there are clear plans towards doing that. In one of the previous mines I worked for, Asanko here in Ghana, we brought in, solar energy into our energy power supply mix, for instance, and many companies have done that. Goldfields in Ghana is trying out battery electric vehicles. My company, Santi Gold Corporation, is actually, doing a major reforestation project, working with local communities to reforest degraded forests, which are actually outside our concession. But these are some of the things we're looking at. We're looking at biodiversity, conducting various studies to ensure that we can preserve the ecosystem as we found it. And then you look at things like water management. Mines are now looking at zero discharge schemes where we recycle the water that is used. We don't discharge. We don't want to abstract fresh water, and all of that, so that you don't affect, water supply to communities and all of that. You're looking at, tailings management, to ensure it's done effectively, and even the way you extract the mineral itself.
Yes.
You want to do it very efficiently. So green mining is actually happening. We just need to, as it were, continue to scale it up and get to the point where we can build mines in Africa which are completely green from start to finish, relying on green energy, electrified, facilities and all that, so which are completely decarbonized. That should be the kind of goal that we should be working towards on the continent.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for speaking to us this evening. Of course, summing the conversation up with Frederic Attakumah, who's president of the Ghana Chamber of Mines.